I put it to you that Messina was stabbed to death whilst tending to the Falconio Cemetery in Melbourne. Do you know the incident that I'm talking about?
I think at that stage we were all shocked. We knew as the case was developing that it was more probable that we were dealing with a homicide investigation, but it wasn't until we saw what was in the barrels as to it was definitely a murder investigation.
Yesterday, Territory Police matched Murdoch's DNA with blood found on the T-shirt of Peter Falconio's girlfriend, Joanne Lees.
He's driven by dark demons and compulsions we can't even imagine.
This guy is pure evil. His eyes, his demeanour, the way he planned it all.
She had been stabbed multiple times. She was semi-naked.
It's the first murder I'd attended and was something I hadn't seen before, there being post-mortem mutilations.
He can rot in hell, that's all I want to say.
Peter Norris Dupas began his reign of terror over 40 years ago, when he was still just a boy.
Dupas first came to police attention as a 15-year-old, where he attacked his neighbour.
Attempting to stab his victim with a kitchen knife, this terrifying method would become a chilling part of his sexual attacks for many years to come, culminating in 3 innocent women meeting a horrific fate.
You are a psychopath driven by the hatred of women.
When 28-year-old Nikki Patterson failed to meet her friend one evening, nobody could have predicted the horror that was to unfold.
The original job had been called in as a suicide by a girlfriend of Nikki Patterson that turned up to go out for dinner with Nikki. So it had been called in as a suicide, but when the van crew attended and also the local detectives, it became very evident to them that it wasn't a suicide and that Nikki had been murdered and also mutilated.
Police sealed off Harper Street just after 7 o'clock last night when a friend of Nicole Amanda Patterson found her body slumped inside the Northcote house.
A trained psychotherapist and counsellor, Nikki Patterson lived in Northcote, Melbourne.
There's a lot of aspects of Nikki. I guess firstly she was a rogue. She was a bit of a rascal growing up, and she just loved life and loved people. Nikki was at I think, the perfect point in her life. She discovered what she wanted to do and who she was. Prior to that, I think she was trying a number of aspects and found exactly where she wanted to head.
Nikki was keen to choose a career that involved helping other people.
She then joined Ardoc Youth Foundation, which was making sure that underprivileged children received an education. And part of that was housing and, if necessary, and clothing and food. She wanted to utilise her psychotherapy qualification and start helping people with counselling. So she cut down to a 7-day fortnight.
Nikki took the decision to set up her own business with a view to building her clients. As a first step, she placed an advert in a local newspaper.
We'll speak to the family. And we started to get the picture together, in fact, that she had just started a career as a psychotherapist, and that would appear to be the first day.
Confronted with a scene of carnage in Nikki's home, officers began their investigations into what could have happened and were quickly given telling clues.
When we started to do the door knocks in the area, it became quite evident that something had occurred that morning. There are a number of witnesses indicated that they'd heard arguments, loud arguments and screaming of a female, but thought it was just a domestic dispute. we put. So that sort of gave us a bit of a timeline in relation to what we thought might have occurred. That sort of started our point of reference, and then from there we, we started to piece everything together.
The murder scene was to hold vital clues for Jeff Marr and his team.
She had been stabbed multiple times. She was semi-naked. She'd been mutilated, and it was obvious to us that there was a sense of some sort of formal meeting of someone because of the tray and the coffee and the plunger and the jug of milk. And the room at the front of the house was set up like a consulting room or some sort of professional room.
Having established her new business from home, it looked like Nikki was preparing for a client when tragedy struck.
We determined, we thought that it was in fact probably a client of hers, and that was indication by the relatives. We looked at all the evidence at the time in the house, and we were drawn towards a diary, and in that diary was the word Malcolm and a mobile or a cell phone number.
This diary entry and telephone number were now a major part of the investigation. Who was Malcolm, and what connection did he have to Nikki Patterson?
It was actually owned by an Indian student. He was alibied, and in fact he couldn't give us and help us anymore. So we made some inquiries in relation to the phone numbers that had been ringing Nikki Patterson's house, and we were able to show that in fact another phone number had rung the house, and that phone number was of Peter Dupas.
Peter Dupas was a 46-year-old local man who lived in Pascoe Vale. Checks were quickly made to discover if he had any previous dealings with police.
We did a profile on Peter Dupas, and we discovered that in fact that he was a serial violent predator against women.
The telephone number at Dupas's address had called Nikki's home 15 times over 40 days. Officers wasted no time in tracking him down for questioning.
We decided that we had enough to arrest him. We grabbed him and he was interviewed, and we noticed that on his face was a scratch, and the scratch seemed to us that it looked like it possibly come from a human nail or striking of a nail down a face.
Nikki had met a violent and horrific death. The scratch may have looked suspicious, but the detectives needed more.
We asked him whether he knows Nikki Patterson, whether he in fact had ever been to Harper Street in Northcote, had he ever contacted Nikki Patterson, and there was a negative response to all those questions. He appeared calm. He appeared sort of, I'll describe him as a bit of a Poindexter, a bit of a blancmange, a bit of a beige sort of person that seemed to be emotionless.
With little cooperation from Dupas, Jeff and his team rushed to search his home and were confronted with startling evidence.
As we walked into the yard, we saw that the garden hose of the house had been repaired with yellow electrical tape. Now, the relevance of that was because there was small amounts of yellow electrical tape found at the scene in and upon Nikki Patterson's body. So it was very relevant to us.
In the rubbish bin at Peter Dupas's home address, when we executed the search warrant, there was a small piece of paper that had been torn up and found at the bottom of his bin, and putting it back together, it actually had Nikki's details and the appointment time and location on the bit of paper.
And it had the word Malcolm written on it, and that was the word and the name of the person that was next to that mobile phone number in her diary for that Monday morning at about 9 o'clock.
Down the bottom of the bin was also a pair of shoes which had blood on the shoes.
We found a kit, we'd call it, with a balaclava and some gloves and some condoms. And then further to that, we also then found a jacket, what you describe as a trucker's jacket, and it had what appeared to us to be blood on the jacket. We further found a newspaper under the sink that had a cut through the face of Nikki Patterson, which was a headline that she'd been brutally murdered.
Within just 3 days of Nikki's violent death, Victoria Police arrested and charged Dupas with her murder.
He gave an alibi at the time that he just sort of filled the vehicle up, he pottered around, did a few odd jobs, and his girlfriend was away at the time and he didn't attend work that day, so he really didn't have an alibi.
Whatever alibi Dupas was to provide, the scientific evidence was to prove overwhelming.
The jacket was important because on the jacket there was a DNA profile of not only Nikki Patterson on the jacket, but also of Peter Dupas, and a combination. We discovered afterward as well, when we collected all the CCTV in the area, that in fact that morning, before he murdered Nikki Patterson, he filled his motor vehicle up with fuel at a local service station, and on the CCTV, you see him paying for the fuel in that green jacket.
The evidence against this vicious predator was now compelling. After a trial lasting 4 weeks, the verdict came through.
Peter was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, which was a great relief to the police and the family who were there every day throughout the trial and remained very strong.
I suppose I felt relief when they caught him. I think I was too shocked to feel anger. I was sort of more saying, he's stolen her, he's a thief, he's stolen my daughter. My family's not whole anymore. They have got the right person, and I wasn't ever in doubt that they didn't have. Well, they just have him off the street, and that he would be punished for the rest of his life.
Peter Dupas was behind bars, but the tragic murder of Nikki Patterson was just the beginning of an insight into this killer's reign of terror. What was to follow would stun the nation.
Dupas, to us, was a violent sexual predator against women. It was quite obvious to us that Nikki Patterson's murder wasn't his first. When we started to probe around in relation to who he was, there was a substantial police file on him.
This police file dated right the way back to the early 1970s, almost 30 years before Nikki's death.
I was at Nunawading CIB, and we got a call to attend a place in Mitcham where there was a complaint of a woman who'd been raped. She was at home when a knock at the door, and she answered to see this person who said his car had broken down, and perhaps if he could have the end of a screwdriver, that he might be able to fix it. She went off to get the screwdriver, and he came in and grabbed her around the neck.
Just days later, the attacker struck again, nearby.
This particular one, he'd gone to the front door and used exactly the same scenario. That my car's broken down, the bonnet was up again, could I have a screwdriver? The woman there was perhaps a little bit more suspicious. She said to him, well, my husband's coming home shortly, perhaps if you wait he can help you fix the car. And with that, of course, he said, oh, don't worry about it, it'll be right, sort of thing. And he left immediately, over to his car, closed the bonnet, drove off. She got the car number.
With a pattern emerging, a description of a man and a car to go off, Ian Armstrong closed in on a suspect, 21-year-old Peter Dupas.
He had his hands clenched together and he'd sort of be looking down as though trembling, and I thought, this guy's going to crack, you know. He looked as though he was just about on the verge of saying, okay, you got me, sort of thing. And then he'd just sort of look up and, no, I don't know what you're saying. not me, I wasn't there. It was as though his whole persona changed, and which was quite strange. I'd never come across a person like this. I thought to myself, this guy's different. He's very much different to anybody I'd encountered.
Despite Dupas's denial, his victim successfully identified him in a lineup. A turning point that would see Dupas put behind bars for the first time.
He ended up being convicted of the offence and being sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. I said that the cold calculating way he went about it, the eyes, everything, it all rolled into one to me saying this guy is evil and in my opinion has the ability, especially where females are concerned, to go all the way and to kill.
A chilling warning from a detective decades before that was to sadly come true. A young Peter Dupas first went to prison in 1974, 25 years before the murder of Nicky Patterson. On his release, he committed 4 attacks on separate women over 10 days in 1979, 3 further assaults in 1980, another rape just 4 days after release in 1985, and the false imprisonment of a woman in 1994.
What we're able to establish by looking into his criminal history is he was a man who was a repeat offender, showed no remorse, and I suspect couldn't even help himself.
Shockingly, despite a lifetime behind bars for killing Nicky Patterson, Australia would be plagued by Dupas's heinous crimes for years to come, as more information started to come to light.
We started to investigate previous murders that maybe he fitted the bill with. And that's why a task force was formed. Paul Scarlett went to the task force and they investigated the murder of Margaret Marr.
Margaret Marr had been murdered in 1997 and her case remained unsolved.
Homicide detectives are investigating the discovery of a woman's body in Somerton.
Margaret lived in the Campbellfield area and was well known for plying her trade as a prostitute. She was described as a fairly harmless woman who was only working enough for the purpose of being able to supply a drug addiction. She was well liked in the area, being that she was just a softly spoken, very quiet lady, and would often be seen at the shopping centre just walking around the shops, selecting items off the shelf and then putting them back. I think that was Margaret's way of just some degree of normalcy in her life, and then from there she would go out and continue to work.
40-year-old Margaret Marr's life took a turn for the worse as she entered her adult years.
Margaret came from a very successful family, a very close-knit family. Margaret was certainly a character as a teenager, and in her later years started to run into a little bit of bad luck, mainly because of the people she was associating with at the time.
Margaret worked the streets to feed her drug addiction, and in 1997, tragedy struck.
Margaret's body was located in Somerton at about 6:30 in the morning by a man and his wife who were collecting cans to raise funds for a charity, I believe. And he saw the pile of computer components and boxes lying in that area and lifted one of them and found Margaret's body underneath.
Margaret had been choked to death, mutilated, and had one of her breasts removed. But despite many police hours, the investigation into her horrific murder ran cold.
There was no new information coming forward, and the difficulty was because of Margaret's past behaviour and her lifestyle. She was a prostitute, she was a drug user, her health was not good, she had some issues health-wise. So the investigators initially couldn't take it anywhere, and the investigation was filed.
But more than 7 years on from her murder, officers would uncover a terrifying link to Nicky Patterson that would blow the case wide open again.
There were only 2 murders recorded in Australia in the last 10 years where breasts had been removed post-mortem, and that was Nicole Patterson, which Peter had already been convicted for, and Margaret Marr.
The injuries sustained to her were very similar to Nikki. In fact, so similar, when we started to review that investigation, we went to the Homicide Monitoring Unit in Canberra, and I gave them parameters of searching murders nationally, and I think it was, the figures were up around the 2 in 10,000 murders nationally that had similar wounds inflicted.
The 2 in 10,000 were Nikki and Margaret. This bizarre mutilation had only happened to these 2 women. It was so rare, it led only to one man, Peter Dupas. But detectives needed to build the case further.
When Margaret's body was located, there were a number of boxes and computer components that were tipped on top of the body. So obviously a lot of that was re-examined, and there was also a female's glove located nearby, and that was tested back in 1997 with the technology that was available then, and we had that glove retested in 2001, and at that time the scientists lifted DNA from inside one of the finger holes of the glove.
This DNA was a massive breakthrough and matched with their prime suspect, Dupas. The chances of it belonging to anyone else were 1 in 450,000.
We used the DNA evidence and similar fact evidence to complete a brief of evidence against Peter Dupas.
Our argument was that the person that did this was one and the same person as the person that had murdered Nicole Patterson, because we said he had a signature, that is the removal of the breast or breasts in the case of Nicole Patterson. You need an unusual feature or an underlying methodology or practice, and we had that.
The argument against Dupas appeared to be mounting, but in opening the case once more, it also reopened wounds for Nikki Patterson's family.
We had to suspend Margaret's trial and effectively reopen Nicole's murder trial and prove that murder to this jury.
It was extremely hard, the Margaret Marr trial. During the trial for Nikki, I was in too much shock, and I sat out on a lot of the parts that were going to be too hard. But this time I sat there and made most of it. There was one instance where they showed video of Nikki in her lounge room, and when they panned around onto her face and her eyes were open, I just walked straight out. You know, it was pretty horrific.
The eventual trial for the murder of Margaret Marr was heard 7 years after her death. Despite the evidence against him, Dupas still mounted a defence.
The defence mentioned that breast mutilation or genital mutilation was a common event during the Vietnam War and with Jack the Ripper. So the defence was that it was not an unusual event and shouldn't be considered as a unique set of circumstances here in Australia.
After a highly charged trial lasting 3 weeks, the verdict came through.
Peter Dupas was again sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murder of Margaret Marr. We felt relieved for the family.
Dupas was now known as one of Australia's most barbaric killers. His depravity held no bounds, taking one of Nikki's body parts after his chilling attack and leaving Margaret with her breast forced into her mouth. With his crimes recorded from the age of just 15, his macabre attacks had escalated over the years, culminating in 2 horrific murders. With such a history, could there be more victims?
Well, it was All Saints' Day, and Messina had gone out in her boyfriend's car to the cemetery to tend to her grandmother's grave.
Messina Halvargis was a 25-year-old bank worker who lived in Mentone with her parents.
Messina was a lovely young girl who lived a very, I'd say, modest life, very respectful young girl.
On the afternoon of Saturday, the 1st of November, Messina took the decision to go to Falconio Cemetery, a vast graveyard in the suburbs of Melbourne. Having bought flowers nearby, she made her way to the Greek Orthodox section.
A slightly built, fragile woman tending her grandmother's grave and, you know, doing the right thing, doing the family responsibility and doing the right and the moral thing.
As Messina knelt down to tend to her grandmother's grave, the unthinkable happened.
She was attacked viciously and repeatedly near the grave, murdered, dragged up into an area between two graves and left there. Messina had been reported missing by her boyfriend and her father, and eventually the trail led back to the cemetery where the vehicle's located, the boyfriend's vehicle was located, and the scene was discovered.
When she failed to return in her fiancé's car, he and his father went to investigate and found the vehicle still parked at the cemetery.
Messina sustained a brutal and frenzied attack, suffering more than 80 stab wounds throughout her body. With such a violent and what appeared to be senseless attack, news quickly spread throughout the community as police tried to catch her murderer.
So far, there are no clues to the motive for the killing.
And we're not discounting the fact that it was a random attack.
There was huge media interest because of the circumstances and the style of murder. We had to track whether or not there was anything in the background of Messina that could take us down a path of issues specifically relating to her, and that wasn't the case.
Before long, information started to flood in.
On the days leading up to the murder, we had a number of women that made statements in relation to being approached by a person, and it showed that he was in the cemetery and stalking these women. I was lucky that they weren't victims of the particular crime that unfortunately fell upon Messina.
During that first period at the crime scene, a lady came forward and provided a face-fit identification diagram. We had it, but it didn't take us any further.
The lady, Mrs. Berman, mentioned a man she had spoken to in the cemetery on the same day as the murder. Acting strangely, she made a note of what he looked like and what he wore, but officers needed more. Over the coming months, Victoria Police would gather over 1,000 statements and interview anybody who might help with their investigation. But this was all to be to no avail.
Our investigations kept going on that, but we weren't having any breakthrough.
This frustration, coupled with no forensic evidence for Greg and his team to go off, meant they were no closer to finding out who had attacked Messina and why.
There were hundreds of information reports created by people trying to assist police. Many exhibits were taken from the Falconio Cemetery: cigarette butts, tyre impressions, prints, samples, witnesses being spoken to, recanvassed, door knocks conducted, media releases.
The hunt for Messina's killer was once again a major focus for Victoria Police, with the government even stepping in with one of the highest rewards ever offered in the country.
In February 2005, the Victorian government released a $1 million reward for any information leading to the capture and conviction of the person or persons responsible for the murder.
This massive financial commitment was pushed with the determination of Messina's family, especially her father, George.
Originally there was a $50,000 reward offered in the case of her murder, but George turned himself into a one-man lobby group, and he went to the government and he got 100,000 and finally, ultimately, $1 million.
With the case now firmly back in the public conscience, the investigation was to take a surprising turn.
There was a turning point when the reward money was released as a result of a couple of witnesses coming forward. That and also making contact with a man called Andrew Fraser.
Andrew Fraser was the underworld's lawyer of choice for many years. He was a hard man for hard jobs.
Andrew Fraser, who was a disgraced lawyer at the time, doing time for drug trafficking, and he had in fact done time with and being in prison with Peter Dupas.
Andrew Fraser was on my list of people to contact, and I left him till last because I really didn't think I'd get any joy. But to my surprise, when I did contact him, he said, "You better come and see me."
Andrew Fraser was one of Australia's top criminal defence lawyers, but convicted of smuggling cocaine, found himself face to face with Dupas in prison.
Andrew Fraser was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment, and that's where Peter Dupas was being housed at that time. Andrew made contact with Peter, particularly Peter, because he was the one that he feared the most, and he wanted to have Peter on side.
Fraser obviously had something to say. Could he provide the missing link officers had been searching for?
I left Melbourne that night and spoke to Andrew Fraser in person at the prison the very next morning.
Paul Scarlett could never have imagined what was to follow.
Andrew alleges that there was one occasion when he and Peter were walking around the garden area of the prison, and a prisoner from another area approached the cyclone fence and yelled obscenities to Peter, saying, "You killed my cousin, Messina." And Peter's responded in a rather colourful way, and then turned around to Fraser and said, "How does that so-and-so know what I've done?" When they were in the garden working, and Fraser has allegedly dug up a knife or a shiv in the garden area and shown it to Peter, and Peter has held the knife in his hands, almost balanced the knife in his hands and mentioned the word Messina, or the name Messina, on a couple of occasions, and has then got rid of the knife. In one particular meeting that Andrew Fraser had with Peter, he was discussing the prosecution case, or the brief that I had served on him in jail for the murder of Margaret Marr. And Fraser argued with Dupas about the DNA that police had found inside the glove, and Fraser said, "You told me there was no DNA left at the scene." And they then got onto the discussion about Messina Helvargas' crime scene, and Dupas responded by saying, "I left no DNA at that scene."
Andrew Fraser was providing the police with explosive information, and more was to come.
Fraser spent a significant time with Peter in his cell talking about general matters, and on one occasion when they were watching television, George Helvargas was making a public plea for Dupas to talk to police, and on this occasion Dupas clamped both of his hands together and started staring into space, rocking backwards and forwards. And Fraser asked him what was wrong, and Dupas then turned off the television.
He actually mimed the murder, showing himself creeping up on somebody and stabbing them in a way that only the police would know was actually right.
This flood of new information could have been the turning point officers desperately needed. It had been 8 years since Messina's death and had cost thousands of man-hours. Now they were potentially one step closer to connecting Dupas to the murder.
I was absolutely relieved to get that information from Andrew Fraser, and I knew that that's all we needed to go to court. We had enough.
But the offer of this priceless information came with a condition.
Andrew agreed to give this information as evidence in court only on the condition that he was released from prison. I did what's called a petition of mercy to the state government to try and get Andrew Fraser out of prison so that I could commence the trial for Messina Helvargas.
It took Scarlett over a year to get Fraser out of prison. But once he was a free man, it was time to go to court.
Andrew Fraser was released from prison at about 5:30 one particular morning, and by 10 o'clock that morning I was charging Dupas with murder.
Can you tell me please your full name and address?
Peter Norris, Dupas, Bowen Prison.
Peter was surprised to see me, but just made a no comment interview and wouldn't cooperate.
I put it to you that Messina was stabbed to death whilst tending to the Falconio Cemetery in Melbourne. Do you know the incident that I'm talking about?
Paul and I spoke to George Helvargas and the family about it, that we were in fact charging Dupas with the murder. It was a pretty good day for the Helvargas family and a pretty good day for us.
One of the most highly anticipated trials in Australian criminal history was to get underway at the Supreme Court in Melbourne, and Andrew Fraser was to be one of the key witnesses.
I did everything I could to corroborate the information that Andrew Fraser gave to me through prison records of including prisoner movement, and I was able to do that to a degree. But the pantomime, obviously, I'm never going to be able to prove that to a court.
In July 2007, a packed court heard the evidence presented by Andrew Fraser as he acted out what Dupas had done in prison, or the pantomime. Other crucial witnesses also took to the stand.
Mrs. Berman made a photo fit. We were challenged that it was made up, but bearing in mind that Mrs. Berman made that face identification in early 1998, and we didn't get those photos of Peter Dupas into our possession until April 1999. So there's absolutely no way that the allegations put to us could have ever occurred.
Another vital part of the jigsaw was now available. Dupas's jacket, found with Nicky's blood on, matched a description Mrs. Berman had given in the cemetery years before, strongly suggesting he wore it during both murders. The defence for Dupas questioned the evidence, even arguing that Messina's fiancé could have harmed her. All the while, the killer, now in court for a third murder, sat giving nothing away.
Dupas always has the same attitude in court. He will just sit there silent, staring straight ahead. Occasionally he will glare at somebody.
After a tense 22-day trial, the verdict was announced.
He was convicted. He received life no minimum for the murder of Messina.
It was just a great sense of relief for the Helvargas family and the Patterson family that were there every day with the Helvargases. Just a great sense of relief.
I think just being there and for them knowing that I understand how they feel. Well, I don't think I ever will understand, because I had 3 days of not knowing. They had 10 years before it went to trial.
Dupas had finally been handed the justice he had long deserved, but this victory was to be short-lived.
Dupas appealed the conviction on the basis of reliability and credibility of witnesses that had identified Dupas from the front pages of the local newspapers, and also the defence raised the issue that they didn't believe Dupas could ever get a fair trial because of the media notoriety of his crimes and his history, criminal history.
To many people's disbelief, the appeal was upheld. This devastating blow meant the guilty verdict for Messina's murder was quashed.
We're just devastated, that's all.
A decision that shocked the nation. A retrial was ordered, meaning police, family and witnesses had to endure the legal process once more.
With the first Messina Vargas trial, I was not involved in the prosecution of that. But essentially, in the second prosecution, we relied on the same evidence, in the main.
The witnesses once again took to the stand, along with Andrew Fraser, who recounted what Dupas had done in prison.
He's jumped up and gone like that, pointing at the wall, and I'm sitting here, so he's turned around, and then he indicated himself, and then he started the flailing motion as if stabbing somebody.
The retrial lasted 26 days.
He was convicted again and he appealed. That appeal was knocked back. Dupas will now spend the rest of his days in jail where he belongs.
Family were very much looking forward to spending their Christmas together for the first time since Messina's tragic death, with this issue now behind them.
Andrew Fraser has now received some of the $1 million reward.
Quite frankly, he deserves it because the Director of Public Prosecution said that without him, there would have been no trial and therefore no conviction.
The infamous reign of terror by Peter Norris Dupas has spanned 4 decades, cost thousands of police hours and much heartache for victims and their families. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
The judge said the question remained of how did Dupas come to be how he is. His actions were not explained by mental illness, drugs, childhood or other trauma, but driven by a deep-seated hatred of women.
But despite some closure for Nikki, Margaret and Messina's families, it isn't the end.
We believe he's suspect in a number of other murders going back to the early 80s. Helen McMahon at the Rye Back Beach in the 80s was murdered, and we believe he's a person of interest in that. The Kathleen Downs murder at a nursing home at Brunswick, and also the murder of Renita Brunton, who was killed in a clothing store in Sunbury.
Peter Dupas is the criminal who won't go away.
I've seen a lot of homicides and charged a lot of offenders, but can I tell you that Dupas is a very, very evil person.
I'm no expert on the conscience of Peter Dupas, but I suspect he hasn't got one. Will he ever confess? I suspect not.
You can't even get any sense of what's going on in his head. The corners of evil in his mind are just beyond comprehension.
He's driven by things he doesn't even understand. So he's in jail to punish him? Not really. It won't stop him. It's to protect us.
This is the worst case of serial killing in Australia's history.
It's the stuff of horror movies.
Torture, electrocution, decapitation, and at one stage, cannibalism.
All of the barrels were full of body parts. The difficulty was, how many bodies did we have there?
There was an officer in charge of the police major crime section, Paul Schramm, who instigated a system in the major crime branch that when detectives had some downtime, which was rare, they would have a look at old missing persons cases. So cases that had perhaps sat idle for a while. They're never closed, but perhaps had sat idle for a while.
I'd only just gone to Major Crime Investigation Branch, and the Missing Persons section came under the same branch structure. So I asked the Missing Persons section to choose 10 files that they thought were most worthy of a review.
The reason he did that was that people who disappear really only disappear for 3 reasons, generally, and one is that they've chosen to, another is that they've taken their own life, and the third is that they've met with foul play. And when that possibility can never be discounted, then a missing persons case is always worth looking at and considering.
One of those files was a chap called Clinton Trezise.
Clinton Tresize was a down-on-his-luck young man who had spent most of his childhood in foster care. He disappeared in 1992 and wasn't reported missing for 3 years.
There wasn't really anything to go on. The usual trails had gone cold soon after his disappearance. Things like transactions in his bank account, they weren't occurring. Some of his possessions had disappeared at the time he did from his flat. A lot of people disappear in that way for whatever reason, and so it was a difficult case. While that was happening, there was another missing persons case that came to the attention of the missing persons unit, which worked side by side with the major crime branch. And that was a person called Barry Lane, who vanished and was reported missing by his family. And it became clear to the police fairly quickly that there was a link between Tresize and Lane, that they were associates.
Clinton Tresize had actually been living with Barry Lane in the early 1990s, and the pair had become close friends. Rumours swirling around Adelaide's northern suburbs even suggested there was a physical relationship between them.
Barry Lane was a bizarre, warped character. He was a pedophile. He was a predator. He had no redeeming features.
The detectives started to look into the background of those two people. And what we learned very early was that they were on a disability pension. Their disability pension was still being drawn down at various ATMs. Traditionally, when you look at a missing persons file, if that is happening, it may indicate that the person is still alive.
Investigators searched Barry Lane's bank account, which revealed that regular withdrawals were being made. For a missing person, that was naturally suspicious, but what was more unusual was that most were being made from a service station north of Adelaide.
Surveillance cameras were installed, watching that particular bank machine at that particular service station. And pretty early on, pretty soon after those cameras were installed, police were able to obtain footage of a person making withdrawals from Barry Lane's bank account. Only it wasn't Barry Lane. And so that left police with a task to determine who that was, and they were able to do that pretty quickly, and that person was Robert Wagner.
Police discovered that Wagner was a friend of Barry Lane's, and now he'd been spotted taking money from the missing man's bank account. 2 weeks later, he was seen doing the same thing again. With Lane now missing for over 6 months, police decided to follow Robert Wagner, and the trail led to the home of a man who also knew Barry Lane. His name was John Bunting.
They had been seen and were known to have frequented each other's homes, hung around in the same areas. The epicentre of that at the time was 203 Waterloo Corner Road at Salisbury North, which is where John Bunting was living with his then wife. And so the names John Bunting and Robert Wagner came up very early in those missing persons investigations.
The pieces of the jigsaw were slowly falling into place. The more police searched, the more links they found between John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and missing people in Adelaide's northern suburbs. Slowly, a sinister tale was beginning to emerge, and in November 1998, it took another ominous turn.
At about that same time, Elizabeth Hayden was reported missing.
When police visited Hayden's home looking for the missing woman, they interviewed her husband, Mark. He claimed the marriage was over and his wife had left. His statement also mentioned another man who had often visited the house, John Bunting. Suspicions of foul play had always surrounded the missing persons cases since the review had started months earlier. But now, detectives were genuinely concerned that there was much more to this than just missing people. Their worst fears were realised when they made a chance discovery at Elizabeth Hayden's home.
They learned that there'd been a four-wheel drive, a Land Cruiser, that had been parked in her driveway. Some neighbours had seen it being loaded up, and it disappeared.
The witness account described Bunting and Wagner loading garbage bags into a four-wheel drive at about the time she disappeared.
The Land Cruiser was important to our investigation because it had disappeared from Elizabeth Hayden's premises at about the same time as she'd gone missing. So it was important to find out, had she met foul play, had she been conveyed in this particular vehicle, what was the relationship with her disappearance?
The Land Cruiser represented a vital clue, the first breakthrough that would eventually lead police to the infamous bank vault and its gruesome contents.
John Bunting, Mark Hayden and Robert Wagner were all interviewed separately, and they all provided a different account as to what had happened to that Land Cruiser, where it had gone and how it had been disposed of. So that immediately rang bells with the police. It became a vehicle that we needed to urgently find.
Bunting and Wagner were soon linked to yet another missing person when the 1996 disappearance of Suzanne Allen was re-investigated. Her file was littered with connections to both men, including the two of them being spotted loading her furniture into a truck around the time she was reported missing.
Throughout the review, gradually the names John Bunting and Robert Wagner just kept coming up as police were making routine inquiries into what had happened to these people. Whether it was as someone who had known them, a friend, had lived with them, or just had made a statement about the missing person's last known movements, those names, John Bunting and Robert Wagner, kept coming up, and eventually that meant they were a focus.
By February 1999, the disappearances of Clinton Tresize, Barry Lane, Elizabeth Hayden and Suzanne Allen were all classified as major crimes. Only a few months later, a fifth name was added to the list, a former lover of Suzanne Allen called Ray Davies, who hadn't been seen since 1995. Police began to link more and more disappearances with the names Bunting and Wagner. But what detectives didn't yet realise was that a trail of missing people across Adelaide's northern suburbs would lead them 150 kilometres to an isolated country town. And Snowtown would become forever associated with one of Australia's most barbaric killers.
Adelaide then, as it is today, is a great place to live and do business. Great scenery, beaches, wine, second to none in the world. But like other cities, some of the lower socio-economic areas do have slightly higher unemployed youth.
There were families for whom employment was unthought of. So it wasn't a case of people wanted to get jobs and couldn't get them, but rather there were whole communities in which it was unthinkable to hold a job.
And with that, you get crime.
Detectives were beginning to strengthen the links between the 5 missing people. Many were having money taken from their bank accounts by strangers. But what was more worrying was that they were all linked to the same 2 individuals, Robert Wagner and John Bunting.
John Bunting didn't have a criminal history, nothing that was serious. There were no serious assaults or anything like that, just minor matters. Robert Wagner, the same, nothing serious.
John Bunting grew up in the suburb of Inala. His parents were good, honest people, and they loved him and they cared for him. But he showed some really concerning traits as a child from very early on, and one of those was the pleasure he used to take in killing things. It started with insects, and he'd experiment with dropping insects into different types of acids or chemicals and see how quickly they died. And as he got older, as a teenager and a young adult, he took a bit more pleasure than you would expect from killing animals and things like that. So there were some early signs that this was a fella who was definitely not right. As he grew a bit older, he also developed an interest in Nazism and white supremacy, to the point where he read a copy of Mein Kampf and upset his mum by painting a swastika on the inside of his car boot. But by his own account, he also suffered a horrible moment of sexual abuse at the hands of a brother's friend, where he was sexually assaulted, or so he would tell years later. And I think that that had a significant impact on him as well.
Wagner was also sexually abused as a young man. Bunting, to some extent, also preyed on that vulnerability. Wagner was very much Bunting's henchman. He was a tall man and provided Bunting with the physical backup that he needed. He needed someone who wouldn't question him or challenge him. Wagner fulfilled that role.
As police attempted to untangle the complex web of missing people that surrounded Bunting and Wagner, their attention focused on Elizabeth Hayden. She was reported missing by her brother on the 25th of November 1998, and she hadn't been seen since.
Elizabeth Hayden was the wife of Mark Hayden. She was not a particularly intelligent person. She had endured a difficult life, and she was someone who existed at close quarters with John Bunting because he was friends with her husband, and she eventually began to irritate John Bunting. He found Elizabeth Hayden irritating, and Mark Hayden obviously developed a dislike for his wife. Mark Hayden is a down-on-your-luck kind of guy. He's a working class person, not very intelligent at all. And Bunting, like he would with other people, would hold court with Mark Hayden, talk to him about things he'd done, boast about violent things he'd done or crimes he'd committed. And Mark Hayden was a weak and an easily led person and quickly fell under John Bunting's spell.
On the 6th of February 1999, what started as a straightforward missing persons case review was reclassified as a major crime. This meant police investigating the 5 disappearances were given more resources, and investigators stepped up the surveillance of the 2 men at the heart of the police operation.
At this stage of the investigation, we had sufficient evidence to go to a judge and to get some telephone intercepts, some listening device warrants. The detectives who were investigating the case were contacted by our surveillance section, who were surveilling Mr. Wagner and Mr. Bunting, and we found that they were heading to Snowtown.
Snowtown's a small rural community about an hour and a half north of Adelaide. Population, I think, in the low hundreds. It's probably full of mostly retirees and farmers from the surrounding district.
Now, this was the first time that Snowtown had come to our attention. We'd learned that there was a person living in Snowtown that they were visiting. So it was that time of the investigation that we thought we should pay Snowtown a visit. When the detectives arrived at Snowtown in Railway Terrace, there was a lot of cars in varying stages of disrepair in the front yard. And to their surprise, there was the missing Land Cruiser that we'd been looking for all over Australia. So that was a significant step in the investigation. Now we had a link between Bunting and Hayden and Wagner and the Land Cruiser.
The Land Cruiser found in Snowtown was last seen at Elizabeth Hayden's house in Adelaide 6 months earlier. Given that it had disappeared at the same time as her, police were keen to find out where it had been.
So we opted to go and speak to the owner of the premises, and he told them that, in fact, that person knew Mr. Bunting, Mr. Wagner, and a person called Hayden, and that in fact these people had rented an old bank building in Snowtown. They then told the detectives that there had been some large black barrels that had been kept in the Land Cruiser, and those large black barrels had been moved into the bank vault.
It was an old, small country bank, disused, apart from being used now for storage of old electrical items, computers and things like that were broken. So once we got in, the side door leads you into the now vacant sort of kitchen meal area of the bank. To the right of that was another door that takes you in to the area behind the bank counters. The vault door was then just to the left as you went in behind the counter. Once we got the door open, we were confronted with just a solid wall of black plastic that was sticky taped, or adhesive tape all the way around.
Now we can reveal never-before-seen footage filmed as detectives entered the infamous bank vault for the very first time.
So they undid the tape, just peered into the darkness of the vault, and they filmed 6 large black barrels, packets of rubber gloves, some bottles of acid.
It was my first week on call, and I received a phone call from a major crime police officer who said, "Evening, Doc. I'm in a little place called Snowtown in a bank vault. It's lined by plastic and there are all these barrels." And so I said, "Well, is it hydroponic or drugs or something?" He said, "No, it doesn't smell like that." And then he said, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, why don't you just open a barrel and have a look and phone me with the results?"
When I took the lid off the first barrel, I could see what appeared to be a mummified foot that was sort of sticking up. I could see the sole of the foot. There was dirty clothing and a hunched up item sort of filling 3/4 of this barrel.
And about 5 minutes later, he phoned back and said there are human remains in them.
I think at that stage we were all shocked. We knew as the case was developing that it was more probable that we were dealing with a homicide investigation, but it wasn't until we saw what was in the barrels as to it was definitely a murder investigation. We could see that there were body parts, and as the other lids were lifted off of the barrels, all of the barrels were full of body parts. The difficulty was, how many bodies did we have there? We could see that there were a lot of body parts, so we knew it was going to be a complex job for the forensic pathologists to literally piece it together. We also wanted to know who these people were. Were they the missing people who had already been reported, or were there other people who in fact had never been reported missing?
As the forensic team got to work, detectives arrested John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden, the men linked to all the missing people. All 3 refused to say anything to the arresting officers. Immediately after the arrests, a press conference prompted phone calls into the police department.
We received a lot of calls from Crime Stoppers, but one in particular was of particular interest. And that call basically said, "We think that you should go out to Salisbury North to a particular address because we think that you'll find a body out there." We used ground penetrating radar, which told us whether or not soil had been disturbed. And under a tank stand, we found such a place. So we commenced to dig there, and about 1 metre down, we discovered a number of plastic bags, which we subsequently learned to be the remains of Susan Allen.
Only hours later, yet another body was found at the address in Salisbury North. The skeletal remains of Ray Davies, who'd been missing since 1995, were found buried in a disused cellar, and the name of the last known resident at the address came as no surprise to the police.
The address where the bodies were found, Ray Davies and Susan Allen, was where John Bunting had been living.
As investigations continued at the house in Salisbury North, the police forensic teams carried on the grim task of determining who was contained inside the barrels retrieved from the Snowtown bank vault.
So one by one, we brought the bodies, still in the barrels, into the mortuary and took the lid off, and then we decanted the fluid, which left the remains. And then we basically just reached in and took the bodies and the body parts out. Now, it was like a grotesque jigsaw puzzle in a way. They had used acid to try and dissolve the bodies, but you need a lot of acid to dissolve bodies. And bodies have a tremendous percentage of water content, and so the water really neutralised the acid. So the bodies were just sitting in this almost sterile, oxygen-deprived environment, and that's why we could actually get some identification. There were tattoos present, there were fingerprints still that could be taken, and also we could see some of the methods that it used to kill these victims. We had 3 cases that had ropes around their neck, and so that suggests that they were strangled with the ropes. They also had gags. There was also evidence of maltreatment. One of the victims had handcuffs still on. There were some thumb cuffs present in the barrel with him. One of the victims certainly had burns across the chest, and a couple of them had blackened areas, I think one on the scrotum and one on the feet, that could have been from burns as well.
What had begun as an investigation into 5 missing people had turned into a multiple murder inquiry. Police had already established that 2 of the 5 were dead. With the 3 remaining individuals still unaccounted for, detectives were shocked when the forensic team reported there were actually 8 bodies contained in the barrels. Were the 3 missing people among them? And if so, who were the others? Just days after the arrests of the 3 suspects, Robert Wagner, John Bunting and Mark Hayden, detectives would find out the answer.
We'd become aware in the investigation up to this point in time that there was a young man called Jamie Vlasakis, who was an associate of the other offenders.
The identity of Jamie Vlasakis is still protected by a court-issued suppression order.
Jamie Vlasakis, like a lot of people in this story, was a person who endured a horrific childhood. He was a young man who was born into a troubled family, whose father sexually abused him and then died when he was very young.
At that point in his life, John Bunting walked in. John Bunting became a huge part of his life. He became the father he never had.
Like so many other people that John Bunting exerted influence over, he was a shining light. He was a way out. He was a rescuer, a white knight, if you like. And that was the dynamic early on between them.
So Jamie Vlasakis was right there, watching and listening as these events started to unfold. And as he grew older and became more useful, John Bunting involved him in these crimes.
Over the course of several interviews, culminating in a 2,000-page statement, Vlasakis would recount a tale of death and destruction spanning almost 8 years. He would also go on to implicate someone else in the killings, himself.
With that knowledge, and under the weight of guilt and shame and despair, he began detailing what he knew about all of the murders that predated his involvement, and then all of the murders that he took part in or was a witness to in some way. And what that did was provide police with a roadmap to this entire series of crimes.
His statement would form the basis of the biggest criminal investigation in Australian history. From the first murder until the last, Vlasakis laid out who the victims were and how and why they had died, starting with Bunting's first victim, Clinton Tresize.
Clinton Tresize was murdered by John Bunting. He was attacked inside John Bunting's house at Salisbury North. He was knocked down and he was attacked with a hammer and he had his skull caved in.
Ray Davies, found buried in the garden of Bunting's house, was murdered in 1995 because he was suspected of abusing children. It emerged that Vlasakis' mother had helped in the killing. Suzanne Allen, also found buried at the house, died a year later. Bunting and Wagner admitted cutting up her body. Vlasakis could also put names to the bodies found in the barrels. To the shock of the detectives, those names included the killer's own family members.
There was a suggestion by Jamie Vlasakis that his brother Troy Yude had molested him when he was young, and that angered John Bunting. He was at home, he was in his bedroom, when Bunting, Wagner, Vlasakis and Hayden all turned up at the house, and then took him into the bathroom where he endured horrific acts of torture, burns, toes crushed with pliers, and was eventually murdered in there.
As the horrific tale unfolded, the scale of depravity got worse. Fred Brooks vanished in September 1998. His mother had had a relationship with Bunting, and he wrongly suspected that Fred was a paedophile.
The murder of Fred Brooks was truly horrific. It was very possibly one of, if not the most horrific of all of these crimes. He endured unspeakable acts of torture before he was finally murdered. He was burnt with cigarettes, he had his toes crushed with pliers, he even had a lit sparkler forced down the eye of the penis, and he was restrained as it burned down towards his own flesh. It was a truly horrific, enduring moment of torture, and so when he was finally murdered, it was probably some point of relief for a young man who must have known that he was going to die.
Friends, too, died at the hands of the cold-blooded killers. Michael Gardiner died in September 1997 because Robert Wagner found his homosexuality offensive. Gavin Porter, an acquaintance of Jamie Vlasakis, was strangled to death in April 1998 because his drug addiction meant Bunting deemed him a waste. Gary O'Dwyer was targeted in October 1998, simply because Bunting said it had been a while since he'd killed anyone. There was also a sense that people were murdered as the killers covered their tracks, or they had simply outlived their usefulness.
Barry Lane was a known pedophile. I think it was because of that background that made Lane a target for Bunting.
Bunting knew what Barry Lane was, in his own mind, right from the start. But he tolerated Barry Lane because he wanted information from him about other people he knew, other pedophiles, people that Bunting wanted to pinpoint, punish, maybe even kill. So John Bunting used Barry Lane for information, and when he was done, or when he could no longer tolerate Barry Lane, he killed him. Thomas Trevelyan was involved in the murder of Barry Lane and helped dispose of Barry Lane's body. Thomas Trevelyan was a marked man from that point on because his behaviour was so erratic and so unstable that there was a risk that he would tell people about what had happened, and Wagner and Bunting knew that, and they killed him by hanging him to make it look like a suicide.
Elizabeth Hayden, the wife of Mark Hayden, whose disappearance ignited the investigation, was also found in Snowtown. Killed because Bunting thought she knew too much. Her death marked a slowing in the pace of the killings as the police operation intensified. Tragically, the 12th and final victim was murdered as the net closed in on the killers.
David Johnson was Jamie Vlasakis' stepbrother.
David Johnson had an interest in computers. He wanted to buy a new computer. And he was told that there was a computer for sale at Snowtown.
But that computer didn't exist. He was lured there, and when he was taken inside that bank building, he was ambushed by Robert Wagner and John Bunting.
He was tortured into giving his PIN number of his credit card. Several of the offenders were sent off to a nearby town to test whether or not the information was in fact correct. And when they returned to the vault, in fact, David Johnson had been murdered by Bunting.
Just 11 days after Johnson was killed, police entered the vault of the bank for the first time and discovered the barrels. Now, with the victims identified, for the police the question remained what could possibly have motivated these murders. The answer to that lay in the dark and twisted mind of John Bunting.
The key to what happened with these murders is Mr. Bunting. I mean, he sits at the centre of it.
He had a hatred of people, pedophiles, homosexuals, and in fact, he was inferring that was one of the reasons as to why he was committing these murders.
Bunting held himself out as a vigilante in relation to pedophiles.
In his bedroom, for example, there on the wall there is this extraordinary plan or map with coloured wool going between all the points, and this is supposed to be the web with all of the connections between these people he's identified as paedophiles. He believes when he walks down the street that he can just see someone and know they're a child molester.
Of course, as we subsequently learned, most of the people who were victims in this horrific crime weren't in that category, and clearly that wasn't the total reason as to why Bunting was committing these murders.
As his crimes unfolded, he killed people for the sake of killing people. The first murder is a quick attack with a hammer. He caves in the skull of his victim. By the time you get to the 6th, 7th murder in this crime series, John Bunting is binding people, torturing them, crushing their toes with pliers, burning them with cigarette lighters and sparklers. John Bunting loved to inflict pain. He enjoyed torturing his victims, and it culminated in the bit that he relished the most, and that was killing them, taking their life.
But what exactly enabled John Bunting to manipulate and even encourage his associates to commit such shocking crimes?
Bunting clearly had an ability to attract certain kinds of people, to convince them, and to establish himself as a powerful leader within that group. But you've got to remember, the group that he established himself within, they're a very vulnerable bunch of people.
He surrounded himself by the weak, the vulnerable, and those who'd been abused.
People who are desperately looking for someone, really, to look after them. He's someone who takes great delight in power over other people. Not just power over his followers, but when you look at the terrible torture and killing that went on, this wasn't simple murder. These were the most dreadful, extended sessions of torture. And that's also about exerting power and control.
Police investigating the bodies in the barrels case, as it was now dubbed, had uncovered what they alleged were 12 brutal murders. Now, in December 2000, the committal hearing began. Designed to test all the evidence before trial by jury, the process would involve almost 70 witnesses.
There was an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of evidence that we had against these offenders. Something like 2,000 witness statements, almost 5,000 exhibits.
6 months into the committal hearing, and with the whole of Australia, if not the world, watching, news broke of a dramatic development in the case. On Thursday, the 19th of June 2001, Jamie Vlasakis pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced in Adelaide Supreme Court to 26 years for his part in the killings. He accepted his punishment and went on to become the star witness against his co-accused.
Whilst we had lots of pieces of evidence, Jamie Vlasakis was the storyteller. Jamie Vlasakis could tell the story of how this could possibly happen. He put the personalities into the equation. He could tell us the whys, not just what happened, but why it happened and how this could happen. Yes, of course it was to his advantage that he assisted. Yes, it meant he got a lesser sentence. But I believe that he was also personally motivated by guilt and a desire to actually do the right thing.
After years of legal arguments, the trial of John Bunting and Robert Wagner began on the 16th of October 2002. Both men were charged with numerous counts of murder. Mark Hayden was charged with 2 counts of murder and several counts of assisting an offender. He would face trial separately.
When John Bunting and Robert Wagner stood in the dock in court, almost always, their mood and their appearance was defiant. They were not people who looked like they had any remorse in any way. They were not people who looked like they were emotionally overcome by the things that they'd done or by hearing about it again. They were defiant.
The prosecution's case was as convincing as it was shocking. Forensic evidence found in the bank placed Bunting, Wagner and Hayden inside the vault in contact with both the bodies and a variety of weapons and tools used to torture and dismember their victims. They could also prove that Bunting and Hayden had rented the bank vault, and financial records illustrated that the trio had gone to great lengths to steal their victims' money. But perhaps the most chilling evidence was found on a series of audio cassettes uncovered during the investigation.
We were partway through the trial. We had a phone call from the police saying they had something that we needed to hear.
And that was a tape recording which purported to be the voice of Susan Allen. And when that was played, it was basically saying, don't worry about me, I've found a boyfriend and I've gone overseas. And in fact, we found some witnesses later on that had listened to that tape in a telephone call, and they believed it to be the missing person. So that did influence police's belief that in fact she was still alive. We of course subsequently found out that that was part of their method of operation.
He would make them read certain things out and say certain things which were recorded, and then these were put together so as to make what appeared to be phone messages to friends and relatives from the person who was now dead.
Given their graphic nature, the audio recordings have never been publicly released.
And also, of course, he extracted information from them about their pensions and their bank cards and things like that. So there was a small element of the pragmatic thief, but a large element of the vile sadist.
During the trial, the jury had to hear about the most horrific details in terms of what happened to these victims. That involved torture, electrocution, decapitation, and at one stage, cannibalism.
It was following the final murder in this crime spree, and that was the murder of David Johnson. And Robert Wagner and John Bunting removed a portion of his flesh in the bank vault at Snowtown and took it across the road in a plastic glove to their friend's house and told him that they had some roux meat to cook. And they fried this piece of flesh in a fry pan on the stove and cut it up and served it not only to themselves but also this friend of theirs. And he ate it and they ate it, and it was a disturbing moment, but the friend didn't know what it was.
The prosecution rested their case after 174 days of arduous and extremely graphic detail. In comparison, the defence team contesting the charges took just 18 minutes. If the court or the media expected to hear any revelations from the killers themselves, they would be disappointed.
At the conclusion of the prosecution case, each of the accused were entitled to give evidence. Both elected not to give evidence and remained silent.
On Monday, the 8th of September, 2003, the jury reached their verdicts. Bunting and Wagner were found guilty on all counts, except the murder of Suzanne Allen. On that count, they couldn't reach a verdict. Bunting and Wagner claimed that she had died of natural causes and they had buried her. The evidence wasn't solid enough to prove otherwise.
The judge commented that they had been involved in killing for pleasure. There was little likelihood of their rehabilitation. So 2 of the offenders, Mr Bunting and Mr Wagner, were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
The jury verdicts confirm Bunting and Wagner as Australia's worst serial killers. Theirs was a remorseless and relentless campaign of murder.
In my view, Justice Martin adopted the only course that was really open to him. The crimes that were committed were so horrific, so beyond human comprehension, that these men can never be released back into the community.
Mark Hayden was eventually convicted of assisting in the murders. The jury were not satisfied that he had been involved in the murders himself, but were satisfied that he had certainly assisted in them. As a consequence, he received a sentence of 28 years.
One of the forgotten victims in the whole sordid saga is the very place that has become inextricably linked to these crimes. The reality is that an old bank in a quiet country town has now in many ways become a shrine to the victims of Australia's worst serial killer.
It's such a shame that Snowtown will always be synonymous with this horrific crime, when in fact none of the people charged ever lived there, none of the victims ever lived there, and only one of the murders was carried out in Snowtown.
It's a terrible shame that Snowtown has been labelled now with this terrible stigma attached to the Snowtown murders. It is a small rural town that already was in decline, and the people there lived quiet lives and didn't need the attention of the world that they got.
People assume that the murders occurred in Snowtown. It's very unfortunate for the small community, but Snowtown is not a good name in Australia.
This is the worst case of serial killing in Australia's history. It's one of the most abhorrent and worst crimes ever committed in this country. And it's also a case that is unique globally in the fact that it was a group of killers which also preyed on itself.
The whole thing is actually, it's the stuff of horror movies. Could something like this happen again? Well, you would hope not, but human nature being as it is, it's possible.
There was this incredible story, hijacked in the middle of Australia, and her boyfriend was missing.
It's hard to imagine anywhere that's more isolated than the outback.
The person involved in this incident is armed and dangerous.
I couldn't imagine a more frightening and intimidating experience.
That magic combination of the British tourist, the human interest, the murder, the mystery.
There was evidence there was a lot of blood there.
If I could say one thing to this man, I would ask him to let the police know where Pete is.
She's the only one that can actually tell anyone exactly what happened that night.
You can't make up DNA profiles. It's either there or it's not there.
This is the first time I've been exposed to that type of voracious, shark-feeding frenzy of the media.
Everyone had a theory.
The question I have is, where is Peter Falconio?
We really still don't know what happened. We really still don't know.
In 2001, English backpackers Joanne Lees and boyfriend Peter Falconio arrived in Australia, halfway through a world trip. They purchased a combi van in Sydney and embarked on an adventure through southeast and central Australia. The couple arrived in Alice Springs, the central heart of Australia, on Thursday, the 12th of July.
Alice Springs was quite a different place then. We didn't really have a crime problem. It was very much a community policing type of style where it was high engagement with people and a great place to live and work. I really enjoyed it.
It's never boring. You know, to me, the world comes to Alice. You don't have to go to the world, you know.
Peter Falconio called his parents in the UK on Friday the 13th of July. The young couple were in good spirits and excited about their travels. The next day, Peter and Joanne headed north on the Stuart Highway towards Darwin.
Joanne and Peter, as we understand it, left Alice Springs around 4 o'clock in the afternoon to head north. They stopped at a place called Tea Tree on the way to get some petrol.
After watching the sunset at Tea Tree Roadhouse, 194 kilometres north of Alice Springs, the couple drove another 100 kilometres towards Darwin, passing Barrow Creek Roadhouse.
They continued on a little bit longer, and Joanne noticed a few fires by the side of the road, not knowing what these were. Peter wanted to stop and put them out. He thought they were a bit dangerous to keep going. But Joanne, feeling a little bit uncomfortable, she said, "No, Pete, let's keep driving. Let's keep driving."
They had been smoking a joint prior to that at Tea Tree, so they might have been a little bit clouded. They may have been, quite sort of dreamy and relaxed and a bit tired, maybe.
My first surprise was that they were still driving. And had bypassed, well, 1 Tea Tree, 2 Barrow Creek, because it had turned dark, and the signs everywhere in those days were just all about staying off the road at night.
You couldn't pick a more remote area of Australia, and that time of year very cold too.
It's very isolated, very little hope of any type of rescue if you get stuck, unless there is passing traffic, and there's very little of that.
Unless you've got a big moon, it's literally just pitch black. You see nothing, only from what your headlights can throw.
Peter noticed some headlights behind them in the Combi and expressed some frustration that the person behind them wasn't trying to overtake, irrespective of how much they slowed the Combi down. Eventually, that four-wheel drive pulled out from behind them, travelled along next to them, and the driver indicated that there was a problem with the back of their camper van.
To have someone drive up beside you in the middle of the Australian outback in his ute and gesticulate to you would have been a bit alarming to most people.
Just after 8 p.m, 11 kilometres past Barrow Creek Roadhouse, the couple pulled their Combi van over to the side of the Stewart Highway.
The man pulled up behind them as well. Peter got out, and Joanne heard a conversation to the effect that there was some sparks coming out of the exhaust pipe. Peter moved back to the front of the Combi van, said to Joanne, "Get into the driver's seat and rev the engine for me."
Then Peter comes back and picks up his cigarettes and then appears to be quite relaxed, doesn't appear to be threatened in any way, then returns to the rear of the camper van and the discussion continues.
Joanne revved the engine and heard what she thought was the Combi van backfiring, as it had done in the past.
In the middle of the outback, in absolute darkness and unfamiliar with the surroundings, the young couple had hoped this stranger would help them during their Australian adventure.
Next thing she knows, a gun pointed at her, and there's a man looking at her through the window.
He then tells Joanne to move over to the passenger seat, and then he proceeds to tie her up.
Stunned and terrified, Joanne's hands were tied behind her back with manacles made from cable ties and tape.
She was in a pretty frightened and terrorised state. She was clearly traumatised by what was going on.
Pushed her out of the van. She didn't know where Pete was. He didn't have the opportunity to restrain her ankles. She was kicking around too much.
He pulled her up, made her stand up, and then guided her past the camper van towards his own vehicle. She never saw Peter's body. She never saw a body at all.
And then somehow he manhandled her into the back of the four-wheel drive.
Screaming and struggling, Joanne Lees lay in the attacker's vehicle, calling desperately for her boyfriend, Peter Falconio.
While she was in the back of the four-wheel drive, she heard some dragging noises, didn't know what they were. She knew that she was probably going to get killed. She was more worried about what would happen before that happened.
Fearful for her life, Joanne Lees made an impulsive and shrewd decision that altered the course of her fate.
She was in fear of her life, and that's what got her out of the back of the truck and running into the bush. She had nothing else to lose.
When you're running into the bush there, you barely see, the bushes in front of you until they're kind of upon you.
The headlights at the time were the only thing that illuminated the scene when Joanne was running for her life through the bushes. It was like a blanket had been put over the world.
I couldn't imagine a more frightening and intimidating experience, knowing that there's really no one to come to your assistance.
Just after 8:30 p.m, in remote and vast bushland, Joanne Leese crouched beneath a bush hidden in the darkness. Having escaped from the man who had attacked her, she remained motionless as he searched for her with his dog.
He was unable to find her once she, shot off into the bush, and then took a turn and ran 30 metres in another direction. So that saved her life. I've no doubt about that.
He looked for her with a torch. The dog never seemed to find her as well. In fact, the dog just ignored her most of the time, as far as she can recall. She slid under a low piece of scrub and just waited there until he left.
People in Britain and other well-populated countries can't imagine how vast the outback is and how lonely you would be if you were suddenly left to your own devices there, particularly if you thought you were being threatened by an attacker.
It would be probably the most intimidating and scary situations to be in.
Hidden from her attacker and unsure of his whereabouts, Joanne struggled to remove the manacles she was tied with.
She heard some movement of vehicles, assumed that he'd taken the combi away. Then she heard footsteps again and the torchlight once more, and then he drove off in his four-wheel drive.
She was hiding in that shrub for 5 or 6 hours in cold winter temperatures. It would have been a very lonely and traumatic experience for her.
And it wasn't until many hours later that she actually ran out onto the road, risking her life in front of a huge road train trailer that drives along the highway. And that's when Vince Miller stopped and picked her up.
60 metres long, lights all over it, 40 or 50 wheels on the thing making a massive noise, but she had no choice but to try and stop this thing in the middle of the night. That's how desperate she was. And then to trust that person to take her to safety.
Unable to stop suddenly, driver Vince Miller feared he had run over the young woman. Stopping the large truck almost a kilometre down the highway, Vince discovered a distressed and injured Lees, who told him and his co-driver of her ordeal. They embarked on a search for Peter, but stopped soon after Vince learned that the attacker was armed and still at large. They immediately drove Joanne 11 kilometres south to Barrow Creek Roadhouse.
An iconic old outback pub, rough as guts, seemingly full of rough characters and whatever, but really with hearts of gold, salt of the earth people.
Barrow Creek proprietor Les Pilton and his partner Helen Jones looked after Joanne and called the police immediately.
Les would have stopped everything. He would have just worked his guts out to try and sort that situation out.
I got a phone call, being kind of one of the more senior police there, to say that they'd received a report of a young woman being abducted and her boyfriend being murdered. So I immediately went to work, I think 3 or 4 in the morning.
A huge manhunt is underway in the Northern Territory, where a gunman is believed to have kidnapped a British tourist and terrorised his girlfriend.
We consider the person involved in this incident is armed and dangerous.
Within 24 hours, over 100 police, volunteers and aircraft had been deployed in the search for the gunman.
Police set up some roadblocks and there was a huge manhunt going on, and amazing detours around the area were being put in place.
The roadblocks really didn't get enacted until the Sunday morning. So you're talking 12, 16 hours from when it actually happened.
North to Darwin, south to Alice Springs, and even south to South Australia as well. And so if you were going to escape, you'd have had a hard time avoiding the police.
Well, he's long gone, unless he's local.
They should have got Aboriginal trackers involved right from day one. The ability of those people is just astonishing. They'll track somebody through vast areas of grass, yet here are some of the best trackers in the entire world, and they weren't really utilised until later, or too late, I think. Yeah.
The police released a composite image of the gunman and his truck, as described by Joanne Leese, in the hope the public would assist in the identification of her attacker.
You just described half of the Territory male population. But as far as that type of Land Cruiser in Alice Springs went, oh, well, they were a dime a dozen.
As police searched for the gunman in the hope of finding Peter alive, blood was discovered at the scene and forensic biologist Carmen Eckhoff was called in to the investigation.
Very quickly obvious to me that there was an area that had considerable blood. There was more blood than what you could see visibly. And then as you could push away some of the top dirt to then expose some of the blood underneath. So yeah, and you could see actually where it's been flicked up to try and cover up the scene.
They'd found the camper van a little further up the highway, parked off the side of the road in deep bush, some distance from where Joanne had been hiding.
I was asked to examine the combi van. Obviously we were looking for blood. We also took out some other items, took a sample of the steering wheel and the gear shift. And the reason being is whoever drove the car must have had to have held it to get it over the rough terrain. Basically, we use a technique of tape lifting, where we take just ordinary sticky tape and essentially go around the steering wheel collecting cellular material. The sample was then put into a sterilised container and it came back with me when I went back to the lab in Darwin for analysis.
4 days after the attack, Peter Falconio's father and brother arrived from the UK. Taken to the site at Barrow Creek, they made a public appeal for any information. As media interest intensified, Joanne Leese remained elusive, and everyone was keen to see and hear from the woman at the centre of the incident.
Media, from not just Australian media, but from all over the world, sort of gravitated towards Alice Springs. So every time you drive your car in and out, you were kind of fighting between vans of cameras, and it consumed the town. It was huge.
Joanne was reluctant to talk about what had happened. She was reluctant to go into any detail about the actual incident. And reporters generally want as much information as possible for their story. Despite the police efforts to try to persuade her to open up and to talk to the media, she kept her lips tightly sealed.
That was probably the main difficulty in terms of trying to formulate a story.
A lot of people just don't know how to handle sudden media attention.
Amid the unprecedented media frenzy and search for word from Joanne Leese, local journalist Mark Wilton received a phone call from Helen Jones, a friend from Barrow Creek Roadhouse who was looking after Joanne.
It was very early on Monday morning that Joanne was with her. She explained to me that Joanne had read the papers, had seen what was in the papers. She wasn't happy with some of the inaccuracies in the story that she'd read so far. The other papers turned up later in the day and they got worse. Joanne was actually quite upset about them.
The information wasn't coming out from the police as much as we would like to have received it, and certainly we were getting no news out of Joanne. In terms of that, yes, of course, news agencies start to create conjecture as to perhaps what the stories were.
As hundreds of media descended on the small town in pursuit of a story or glimpse of Joanne, Mark Wilton was invited to an interview to clarify issues Joanne had with media reports.
She wouldn't answer anything to do with the actual incident, as it were, because she'd been asked not to. Police didn't even know she was doing the interview, mind you, but she said, I don't really feel as though I should. And a lot of that she did say was out of respect for Pete's family. She said she'd never at any stage said she heard a gunshot, what she thought was a gunshot. She thought it was the combi backfiring. She just wanted to set the record straight in a few things. I found exactly what I thought. Somebody who'd been through something quite traumatic.
11 days after the attack, Joanne Leese finally agreed to face the media. Accompanied by Peter's brother, Paul Falconio, Joanne made a brief, prepared statement.
If I could say one thing to this man who did this, I would ask him to let the police know where Pete is.
It wasn't going to be any ordinary media conference. She wanted to stage it on her terms. Her terms were, I want a list of questions beforehand.
She wasn't going to talk to the media en masse. It was not going to be a press conference as we kind of thought it would be.
She was given the list of questions by the police and she crossed 10 of them off. I don't want to talk about this, I don't want to talk about this, I don't want to talk about that.
Anyone that's spoken to me or has been in contact with me, no one doubts me.
And the comments that she made in that press conference kind of stung a little bit because we'd only been in this story for 11 days so far, but she'd already created this rift between, I guess, what the international media and the local media were looking for and what her perspective on it was.
It didn't really change anything. It sort of opened up more questions than anything else.
Joanne's conduct had become cause for concern and frustration, and public speculation about her inaccuracies in evidence would cause further tension and doubt.
There have been suspicions about her story. In an attempt to put the rumours to rest, Territory Police for the first time produced photos of the injuries she received that night.
Although there was evidence at the scene, there wasn't a whole lot of it. So there was still too many questions to answer. And of course the police have to discount the people who are so close to the victim to start off with to make sure, to rule them out. But I don't think they necessarily ruled her out entirely as far as the media were concerned.
People expect victims to act in a particular way, and when they don't do that, they then create a bit of mistrust around them. So I think that's what happened with Joanne. She knew that there was people who were investigating the matter that just didn't believe her.
I knew that the English press were tough, but it wasn't until I received that note back from just one news editor out of the many that I was dealing with that said, "We reckon she did it." And then I thought, hang on a sec, there's another story going on here.
Northern Territory Police were overwhelmed with the influx of media, whose pursuit for information was unrelenting. When news of CCTV footage surfaced,
There'd been a rumour, a suggestion, that the gunman or the attacker had been caught on CCTV footage at an Alice Springs service station. But no CCTV footage had emerged.
I think it was 19 days, I think, roughly after the incident, when we knew about the video.
Where had that footage gone to? Why had the police not used it to find the attacker and publish those pictures on the TV and the internet and the newspaper?
The story was that they sent it away to get enhanced. You've got to realise that this footage at the time had what they believed was the truck that he was driving, and they didn't even put that out.
It was critical that we tried to get the registration number of the vehicle. And we tried everything, the most sophisticated technology to be able to do that.
You could have identified the car off the CCTV.
I don't think anyone would doubt that it could have been handled a whole lot better.
I think also in defence of the team, we were consumed with thousands of lines of inquiry. Where we went wrong is how we prioritised what was important and what wasn't.
5 months into the investigation, amid a task force shake-up and mounting frustration with media pressure and police procedure, a new lead detective was appointed.
I got a phone call from Paul White, who was just taken over as the new commissioner, and said, "Congratulations, you're now taking over the Falconio investigation." I put the phone down and I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, in all honesty, because it didn't seem to be particularly well organised.
In 2001, Colleen Gwynn was the regional superintendent for the Central Region in Alice Springs.
I observed for probably about a week, and it was clear to me that we had a task force that wasn't gelling very well. There was people there that I don't think were there for the right reasons, and there was a number of people that didn't actually believe the victim. So when you're investigating a major crime such as this, you have to believe the victim. Otherwise you will get careless and you'll miss things. So the first thing I did was get some detectives on aeroplanes and go and follow up what I saw was the priority inquiries. And I think that's probably one of the best decisions I ever made.
Months after her traumatic experience, Joanne Leese returned to the UK, disillusioned with the police and wary of the media.
Oh, she was angry. She was frustrated. She didn't trust us. She didn't believe that we had the ability to be able to investigate this matter. Yeah, look, we got a lot of things wrong. We spent some time with her. We were able to clarify some of the areas that were perhaps a little bit confusing. It then also reinforced my view that we had someone who was a remarkable witness. It was just incredible, that her recollection and her ability to articulate things that happened in the most traumatic event that anyone could ever go through.
Task force members whittled down the number of suspects from 3,000 to 26 men. They had assembled a DNA profile and possible identity of a suspect they were particularly interested in locating.
We had a DNA profile from an unknown male, and that residual was very similar to the DNA profile that we found on the back of the T-shirt that belonged to Joanne.
With the discovery of a DNA profile, the task force were hopeful to compare results with national and international databases. Disappointingly, there was no match.
That was a beautiful profile. We got a full DNA picture from it. That unknown profile that we found on the T-shirt is also present on the gear stick and on the steering wheel, which just gives a bit more weight to the police saying, well, if they find this person, then they know they can ask the questions and interrogate them to say, well, you know, we also know that you were in the vehicle. How come your DNA's in the vehicle?
Carmen Eckhoff was our forensic expert here and did an outstanding job. I think Carmen was such a critical part of our case. The forensic area was critical. So they were there side by side with us for a lot of time during the preparation of our case.
Forensics meticulously tested the manacles with which the attacker had tied Joanne's wrists.
The manacles were a homemade attempt of making handcuffs, made with cable ties and black tape. Even though she was handcuffed at the back, she managed to skimmy out of them, and everybody was very disbelieving of it. But she was able to do it because they'd put that extra link in the manacle. There was a lot of strawberry lip gloss on the manacles, which Joanne had with her and was using to try and grease up to try and get out of it. It sort of masks any fingerprints that you may have found on the manacles when he tightened them. We had to find ways of getting tape to lift without damaging any DNA that could be underneath. Mostly it was Joanne's DNA on the outer surfaces, but further underneath the tape we did find traces of DNA from an unknown person.
With the discovery of DNA in the manacles, the forensics team sought out the expertise of Dr. Jonathan Whittaker, an English DNA scientist who specialised in low copy number, a sensitive DNA profiling technique that amplifies the levels of DNA from small amounts of starting material.
I actually sent him the results I'd received when we attempted it in our lab, and asked him if, you know, he would think that that was good enough quality to report on. And it was decided that I should take the centre loop manacle that we hadn't actually examined at all, and I was to take that over to Jonathan and his team for him to do the low copy number. The results were essentially the same. Theirs was, their results were a little more clearer, if you like, but because their technique had been peer-reviewed, it meant that the results could be accepted by the courts.
The DNA evidence was pivotal, and police were keen to find one suspect from early in the investigation and verify his DNA. Finding him, however, would prove a difficult and onerous task.
Bradley Murdoch was one of the early suspects in the hunt for the Outback gunman. He was interviewed by police in Broome, who accepted his alibi.
It was clear that his behaviour and what he'd done following the events of the 14th of July were odd, and he'd changed his appearance, he'd changed the appearance of his vehicle. He was acting like a man who was running away from something. We should have made him more of a priority, and if we did, we would have had him much sooner.
Murdoch was known to the police for different reasons. As it turned out, you know, he was painted as somebody who was definitely involved in the drug game.
43-year-old Bradley Murdoch lived in Broome in northwestern Australia. He was known to police as a local drug runner and served time for reckless use of a firearm. Questioned in 2001, local police accepted his alibi. after he stressed he couldn't have driven the 1,943 kilometres back to Broome within 24 hours after the alleged incident.
That came up time and time again. You couldn't have done it. You couldn't have committed the crime, gotten back to Alice Springs and then head down the Tanami and made it to Broome. We did a reenactment with a similar car, similar weighted down, the same, pretty much followed it to a T, and we made it within plenty of time. And that was a critical part. There was more than enough time for Bradley Murdoch to do what he did and arrive in Broome.
As forensic and task force investigators closed in on Bradley Murdoch, he went to ground.
Well, Murdoch was spending a lot of his time in South Australia in the Riverland, living on the guest house of a Swan Reach property that was owned by a man, a woman and a young child. He was turning that guest house into a bit of a bunker, turning into a bolt hole that he could hide in.
He was ready to go. He was on the run. He knew we were after him and he knew it was only a matter of days before we turned up and arrested him. So he had packed his vehicle up and he was going to hide. He was heading off to Western Australia, somewhere where he couldn't be found, so he was on the move.
We got word that Murdoch had been arrested and was going to stand trial in Adelaide for rape, specifically the unlawful sexual intercourse with a 12-year-old girl and the rape of her mother.
But it's his DNA that could also hold the key on the night Peter Falconio disappeared.
I knew that they had a bloke for a long time they were very keen on being able to get hold of, but I do know that DNA was an issue for them. And their break came in South Australia, basically.
So he was charged in South Australia and I met him while he was on remand in Yatala prison. He wouldn't give us an interview at the time, but he did have a long conversation with us about his involvement or non-involvement in our matter here in the Northern Territory. Quite an intimidating man. We didn't actually address the evidence. He spoke and he raised different components of our evidence. Obviously the truck stop video, because it had been all over the news hundreds of times. So he wanted to let us know that, yeah, that was him, but it wasn't on the night that we're referring to.
We were left with a truly bizarre situation. We were allowed to name Bradley Murdoch within South Australia with regard to the rape case. We were not allowed to link him to being a suspect to the Falconio case, because as the defence had said from the very start, their case was that this matter had been created, fabricated, that their client was being framed purely to get his DNA onto the public record so that it could be used in the Falconio case.
There was no doubt in my mind that he was panicking underneath his kind of tough exterior where he was trying to intimidate me. Inside, I imagine that there was absolute panic.
After little physical evidence was found to support the rape and abduction charges, Bradley Murdoch was acquitted after the jury's verdict was not unanimous.
The judge turned to Murdoch in the dock of the court, said, "Mr. Murdoch, you're free to go." As the sheriff's officer opened the door to the dock, the Northern Territory Police that had been perched for 2 weeks flooded into the dock, trying to push the sheriff's officer away to grab Murdoch.
We had to be in a position to execute an arrest warrant and get him up to the Territory, which we did the day that he was acquitted in South Australia. We were there and took him into custody.
Grabbed him by the top of the head and shoved him, basically folded him, because he's such a tall man, into the back of this car while the media's filming it. The Territory coppers watched the car go off and say, "See you in Darwin."
After dramatic scenes inside the Adelaide courthouse, Bradley Murdoch was arrested and transported to Darwin to face charges over the murder of Peter Falconio.
But he was a large man. He was known colloquially as Big Brad amongst his contemporaries and colleagues. So he was very imposing.
Circumstantially, it read very, very badly for Murdoch.
We had a great legal team. We had a great case, and we knew that, and we'd done our homework, and we knew we were presenting a matter that would be committed to trial, absolutely.
Yesterday, Territory Police matched Murdoch's DNA with blood found on the T-shirt of Peter Falconio's girlfriend, Joanne Lees.
In May 2004, 2 years and 9 months after the attack, Joanne Lees arrived back in Australia to face Bradley Murdoch at the committal hearing.
If there was any anxiety, it was probably around Joanne's welfare. She was back in the Northern Territory. It's a place that doesn't have a lot of great memories for her.
Joanne was arriving in a police squad car, unmarked, driving at breakneck speed.
So that didn't do her any favours whatsoever. Had she just come to the court, walked along the pavement in a normal manner, then everything would have been fine. She might have got a lot of attention, but certainly it wouldn't have attracted the negative publicity that she got as a result of the car.
There was issues with the transportation of Joanne to and from the court and her safety and the attention and the perception that still she wasn't a credible witness.
The committal was pretty brutal for her. I mean, the journos were pretty cruel.
During the committal hearing, startling evidence emerged about an affair Joanne had in Sydney in 2001. Her reliability as a witness, police procedure and contaminated DNA evidence were all called into question. Despite the salacious revelations, after 5 weeks of hearings, Bradley Murdoch was ordered to stand trial.
We had to then get our case together. The work really started, and it was like our second phase. We got our man, now let's get him convicted.
On the 17th of October 2005, the criminal trial began. Peter Falconio's family returned to Australia, and Joanne Lees possessed a confidence not publicly seen before.
When the court case came around, she was very much more professional in her presentation. She even strode up the front steps of the courthouse, acknowledged the media.
Bradley John Murdoch maintained his innocence and entered a plea of not guilty. His legal team were confident leading into the trial.
When Bradley Murdoch appeared in court, he looked like a man who was pretty confident about being found not guilty.
I do know that he intimidated a lot of the witnesses just with his mere presence.
There was something like 80 witnesses called, more than 200 pieces of evidence.
A surprise witness for the prosecution was James Heppy, a former associate, friend and housemate of Murdoch's. His evidence would prove controversial and elicit a vicious exchange between both men in court.
He was a man that had a disgruntled relationship with Bradley John Murdoch, no doubt about that, and the jury were directed to take his evidence.
He was trying to negotiate his way out of a long prison sentence. He said to the police, if you look after me, then I will help you convict Bradley Murdoch.
My problem with Heppy is that it's tainted evidence no matter what you do with Heppy. It's, you know, he's a former partner of Murdoch's.
After volatile scenes inside the courtroom, the case continued, and British DNA scientist Dr. Jonathan Whittaker took to the stand.
The DNA evidence was certainly very well prepared, presented in court, and even the three judges made the comment that the DNA evidence is watertight and that Murdoch's team would not be able to have that DNA thrown out.
There was a lot of doubt about the whole DNA business. There was a lot of doubt about the so-called low copy number DNA and whether or not it could be expanded and could be used as a match against Murdoch's DNA.
Whether you believe or don't believe in low copy number, ultimately it's the whole case that goes before the court and is judged against. I'm a firm believer that you can't make up DNA profiles. It's either there or it's not there.
Murdoch's defence lawyer, Grant Algie, questioned the contamination of DNA in the manacles, claiming poor police procedure and tampering of evidence.
I think our biggest issue with DNA is contamination. I was asked to retest the homemade manacles, and I think it came out in court that my director at the time, Dr. Peter Thatcher, had his DNA turn up. The testing is so sensitive, it's really difficult to say exactly how it got there. I can't answer that, but I'm expected in court to then give an answer. So I was against retesting, but I was forced to do it.
The DNA evidence and the eyewitness evidence of Joanne are the only two things that that could put him. Everything else was totally circumstantial.
What I think we've all lost sight of is the fact that even though we have DNA evidence, it's still up to the police to piece together the whole case to present that for the courts, and then it's for the courts to decide.
In the last days of the trial, the defendant Bradley John Murdoch took to the stand.
He had to take the stand because some of the evidence against him had become so damning. And Rex Wild, who is one of the most incredible prosecutors, stood up and said to Bradley John Murdoch, "Where did you bury Peter Falconio?" That was his first question. And it took Bradley John Murdoch by surprise, to the point that he actually appeared somewhat insulted. Look, we knew that Bradley John Murdoch was a bad man, and I guess those layers began to peel off as the questioning continued. But there was really nothing that Bradley John Murdoch offered to the court in his testimony that discounted the fact that he was the man that committed this crime.
After a 9-week trial that heard allegations of controversial and contaminated evidence, a witness who was unfaltering in her story, and a defendant that staunchly denied guilt, the jury returned with a verdict.
A Darwin jury found Bradley John Murdoch is the Outback Killer, declaring him guilty of the British tourist's murder.
There was a unanimous guilty verdict from the jury, guilty after guilty after guilty.
I think probably the jury made the right decision in the circumstances. Whether it reflected the accuracy and the truth of the crime remains to be seen.
I wouldn't have convicted him on the evidence that was presented in the court.
I was just happy that we could play our part and get a conviction and put Bradley Murdoch behind bars for 28 years.
After the verdict, Joanne Leese and the Falconio family addressed the media outside the courthouse.
I'm obviously delighted with the unanimous verdict given here today.
The most important thing to my family now is to find Peter's body.
Bradley John Murdoch was jailed for a non-parole period of 28 years, while Joanne Leese was pursued by continuous speculation as to the credibility of her story. A story that has reportedly earned her over $500,000. Murdoch unsuccessfully appealed his conviction and is currently serving a life sentence in Darwin's Berrima jail. He maintains his innocence as public speculation continues about the incident and the whereabouts of Peter Falconio.
I've always felt that there is another chapter to be written in this story. What really happened to Peter Falconio? What was the motive? Who killed him? Was it really Bradley Murdoch?
This is the case in Australia that never ends, and I don't think there will be any conclusion until perhaps the remains of Peter Falconio are found or someone with more information about the case comes forward.
It's just a pity that someone lost their life here, and I guess with Joanne, you know, she lives with this every day. And the Falconios are still without their son, who they don't know where he is. So you have to remember about the people that are part of this, and that's not us, but it's them.
You know, until that body is found, we will not know one way or the other categorically what happened to Peter Falconio.